Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. Welcome to this Climate Action Accelerator webinar. There are still people joining, but we're going to get started to respect the timing. So my name is Sonja Schmid. I'm leading the solutions team at the Climate Action Accelerator. And so the topic of our webinar today is how to engage suppliers in carbon and environmental impact reduction. So for many organizations, supply chain related emissions are among the largest source of emissions. For CIA partners, they make up 40 to 60% of their carbon footprint. And they're also among the most challenging to reduce, as organizations have to influence practices of their suppliers, which is by definition outside of their direct parameter. So this is the topic we're trying to tackle today in this webinar. Before we get started, I just want to give you a few practical information. Next slide, please. So the webinar lasts until 2:30 p.m. CET. The webinar is going to be recorded. We'll make available both the replay and also the slides on the website and our YouTube channel. Registered participants also will receive an email with the respective links. Then we kindly ask you to keep your audio and video off during the webinar, unless you're given the floor during the Q&A session, of course. Please feel free to ask any question that you have. You can write it in the chat or raise your hand during the Q&A session, and then I will basically give you the floor in the Q&A session. There is also a translation available via the automatic Zoom plugin. Next slide, please. So please click on the small arrow next to the icon Show Captions. You can see it on the slide. And then you have to select the spoken language and the language you want to translate into. If you have any issues, please write it in the chat and a colleague of mine will be able to help you. Next slide, please. So just a super quick introduction to the Climate Action Accelerator. We're a non-profit organization based in Geneva. Our aim is to scale up climate action within the international aid and health sector. We're supporting our partner organizations towards a radical transformation of their practices and supporting them to halve their emissions by 2030. They benefit both from close support of the Climate Action Accelerator in building the individual environmental roadmap and action plans, as well as a network to exchange good practices with their peers. Next slide, please. We have, as of today, 25 partners that have joined the initiative and also committed to reducing their emissions by 50% by 2030, as well as to reducing other environmental impacts of their operations. And we're also an official partner of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Next slide, please. So without further ado, we're gonna dive into the webinar topic of today. So together with our three speakers, we would like to explore why it is actually so crucial to work with suppliers for any roadmap or strategy to reduce the carbon and environmental impact of an organization, which approaches exist for engaging with suppliers, and then of course how our organization actually concretely implementing them. So really trying to be as practical as possible, and please feel free to ask our speakers any questions you might have. We have enough time at the end. So therefore, we will also less focus on different available approaches and how to do the data collection. That's actually not the key topic today. It's really about what are the ambition towards suppliers and how are organizations working with their suppliers to achieve them. So with us today are Phoebe Bridges, account manager at CDP. CDP is a not-for-profit organization that offers a global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions. She will showcase the importance of supplier engagement based on CDP data and also provide an overview of different approaches that CDP members employ to work with their suppliers. Then we have with us Marcus McKay, who is Head of Sustainable Supply Chain at UNOPS. He will present the UNOPS Supplier Sustainability Programme, the organization's unique approach to collaboratively engaging with suppliers towards managing and advancing sustainability in the supply chain. And then last but not least, Sarah Ouanon, Head of Net Zero Delivery and Partnerships at the NHS England. And she will speak to the implementation of the net zero commitment across supply chains through the NHS Net Zero Supplier Roadmap. Thank you very much to our speakers, and I'll pass the floor to Phoebe. Phoebe, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you for that kind introduction. Great. Good afternoon, or perhaps good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm delighted to be presenting to you all. My name is Phoebe Bridges, and I've been an account manager at CDP and the supply chain team for the last few years in our London office. So I work really closely with a number of organisations across a variety of different sectors, really to help them engage their suppliers through the CDP platform and help them gain insights through the data and drive emissions reductions. So today I'm going to talk about supply chain engagement and the importance of Scope 3, but I'll start by introducing you to a little bit of the work that we do at CDP, why we do it, before delving into why companies are taking action on their supply chain and actually how they're doing it. So next slide, please. So I'm sure a number of you on this call will have potentially come across CDP or perhaps even responded to CDP before. But to set the scene, we are a disclosure platform that collects environmental data from companies, cities, states, and regions across the areas of water security, forests, and climate change. And as a non-profit, we work with over 745 investors and 330 purchasing organizations around the world who use CDP data in key business decisions around resource and climate risk and impact, and also to track progress towards their own targets. Our mantra at CDP is you can't manage what you don't measure, and ultimately we do really exist to ask companies to measure and report on the environment and then reduce impact by using the insights that they've gained. As I mentioned just before, we do work across a real variety of sectors, mostly in the private sector, from Microsoft to Boeing, to AstraZeneca, Coca-Cola, L'Oreal, and also the NHS, who will be speaking after me. Over the last 20 years, we have been pretty busy accruing primary data from these different companies and their suppliers as well. So much so that CDP actually has the largest corporate environmental data set in the world. So today I plan to stop harboring all of those insights and share some interesting facts, figures, and trends on Scope 3 and supply chain engagement with you all. So to kind of take a step back on the next slide, please, and to kind of kick things off, why do companies want to do the very challenging job of trying to manage something seemingly out of their control, their indirect impact? So firstly, I'm sure we've all seen the IPCC report, and we all know that things are going to get pretty messy pretty quickly if we don't bend the curve on emissions. And for me, this stat is really poignant. So CDP data found that supply chain emissions are on average 11.4 times higher than operational emissions. And of course, as you can see from the chart, that does depend on the sector that you're in. If you're in an organization in power generation, then you're probably going to be mostly concerned about your downstream emissions. But for the large majority of organizations, your biggest impact lies in your supply chain. Next slide, please. So aside from the huge elephant of impact in the room, there are also lots of other factors to consider. And this slide really intends to highlight that unknown risks carry costs. There are financial tags associated with having risks in your supply chain, and that actually translates into, on the next slide, we think this cost. Bearing in mind, this is a finger in the air calculation, and actually the trend that we're seeing is the more data that gets reported, the larger these sums are getting each year. And we don't know when these costs are going to fall. We don't know how they're going to fall, and we don't know who they're going to hit. So really the organizations that are starting to get their house in order when it comes to engagement and integrating data into procurement decision making, even if you're just monitoring supplier progress and just keeping your finger on the pulse, you're going to be in a much better position when any supply chain disruption or transfer costs and risks come down the supply chain and potentially hit you. And it's not just CDP data that's highlighting the importance of measuring and tackling Scope 3. You only really have to have one eye on the news to see that there's kind of a surmounting evidence that supply chains have to ready themselves for the many risks that are perhaps already here. And these aren't just physical environmental risks, but also perhaps the legal liability and regulatory risks linked to them. On top of growing geopolitical and trade tensions, commodity shortages, and also the increased exposure of SMEs to market volatility. So it's not really surprising that the private sector are beginning to face a rapid growth in regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So we know that supply chain engagement signals increased business stability, but it also has brand and reputational benefits. And most importantly, it helps to tackle what is probably your largest source of emissions. But it doesn't come without its challenges, hence why only 39% of companies reporting to CDP in 2022 reported engaging with suppliers on climate matters. And we know that figure isn't where it needs to be to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Companies have to start managing what is within their control, and what is within their control is really their relationship with their tier one suppliers. I don't want to spend too much time here, as I obviously would prefer to focus our energy on approaches over challenges. But yeah, it goes without saying that it isn't easy. And engaging supply chains takes time, effort, and also a robust strategy. So if your organization is completely new to this and unsure where to start, I'd thoroughly recommend trying to learn from your peers and the challenges that they've faced, what they've done to overcome those challenges, and also their strategy, which is why I'm delighted to be speaking alongside both Sarah and Marcus today, who both offer fantastic examples. On the next slide, please. I would also thoroughly recommend starting to integrate emissions data collection into your procurement processes, as ultimately, and to use the old cliche again, you cannot manage what you don't measure. So to truly understand emissions reductions and supply chains, you do need to be kind of collecting accurate primary data. And collecting this information and deciphering insights on your own can be quite difficult, which is why services like CDP Supply Chain exist. So companies work with us to use our questionnaires as a vehicle to get the data they want. Our climate change questionnaire is extremely comprehensive, but it could also offer you a useful framework for you to use to determine what kind of questions you want to be asking your suppliers. Arguably, though, it's a bit too long for SMEs, and hence we are creating a new SME questionnaire this year. But obviously, CDP isn't the only provider in this space. There are plenty of others out there who can help you to collect that data and build capacity with your suppliers. Next slide, please. So this is a typical journey on a company's pathway to environmental stewardship. However, I should stress that it isn't always this linear. To make it kind of easier in terms of building capacity with suppliers, a lot of the companies that we work with will assess response data using categories. And so in this example, we've got kind of 3 categories or phases, with phase 1 being those just starting, kind of becoming familiar with emissions accounting and starting to disclose to CDP or any service provider. And once suppliers have understood their impact, they can then begin to actually start managing it and reducing it through emissions reductions targets in phase 2. And then finally, for companies in phase 3, these are organizations starting to look, beyond their own operations and engage with their customers or their own suppliers. So by categorizing them based on the maturity, you can firstly understand the maturity of your supplier base. Secondly, you can track your progress in capacity building amongst suppliers by actually attaching KPIs like a long list instead of the data points listed here, and then whatever's important to your organization. And then finally, more effectively tailor your engagement efforts, as your approach is really likely to be quite different for those suppliers at each end of this roadmap. On the next slide, we can see a few CDP stats here. So in kind of terms of what other approaches companies are choosing when they work with suppliers, this can really, really vary. And it's a bit of a balance really between the kind of the carrot and the stick approach, where some will try to persuade and incentivize, whilst others might introduce stricter requirements. Of course, the market position of your buying organization will affect which approach is most suitable for you, as well as your own organization's buy-in to that approach. As you can see from here, 30% of disclosures to CDP reported climate requirements as part of their purchasing processes. And some organizations I work with do use contract value thresholds to format that ask. So for example, suppliers with a lower contract value will be asked to publicly disclose scope 1 and 2 as a minimum, and then scope 3 within a certain time frame. Others, and perhaps a little bit more extremely, have introduced the requirement of actually having an approved science-based target for contract values above a certain criteria. In terms of trying to influence and incentivize with the more carrot approach, we typically find that supply chain engagement works best when procurement and sustainability teams are aligned. Really, buyers are so important as the relationship holders. And my team spend quite a lot of time training procurement teams so that they're able to discuss CDP results with suppliers and highlight where the business would like them to improve. But regardless of whether that feedback is coming from sustainability or procurement, it is really important to just have that feedback mechanism in place, especially for suppliers who are still figuring out how to report their emissions. So really that they can actually understand how to improve, and then you can have confidence in using the primary data in your scope 3 calculations. One of the organizations that I work with has actually gone far beyond this in terms of standard KPIs internally, and they've even created financial incentives for their procurement teams, setting their regional teams with an objective of their suppliers having a really high CDP response rate, and making progress on specific questions from their previous year CDP response. Next slide, please. So these approaches do prove successful, and these stats just highlight that. Although these figures are from all disclosing companies, just worth mentioning, not just those that are supply chain only requested. So creating a framework to annually request information and progress towards targets, and then actually support that request through incentives, influence, or stricter requirements does work. In the same trend, similar questions within the CDP questionnaire, such as targets or emissions reductions initiatives, leads those who haven't thought about it before to start thinking about it and act on it over time. And organizations do get to a point where their suppliers, their own suppliers, are ready to turn around and actually ask their own suppliers for data and really create a kind of cascading domino effect down the supply chain. Next slide, please. So penultimate slide here. So obviously the aim of the game here is to reduce emissions and minimize your scope 3, which is why it's really pleasing to see that in 2022, CDP members drove a reduction of 70 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent through implemented initiatives, really highlighting the strength of purchasing power there. For insights like this and others that I presented to you today, I'd point you towards CDP's annual supply chain report, which is available through our website. In each report, we highlight really interesting trends we've identified from the last disclosure cycle, and include member case studies there as well, which are really useful. The next report is due in June, but in the meantime, there's plenty to get your teeth stuck into from previous years. So my final slide for you today, which is mostly just a summary of some of the points I've raised. Next slide, please. So in terms of what you can do with the data and different approaches you can take, by collecting data from your suppliers, you can start to understand your suppliers' maturity, as I've mentioned, and then start building capacity with them to reduce their impact, and in doing so, reduce yours. If you want to start getting even more granular, you can start collecting life cycle analysis data, because really by going through and looking at a very specific product throughout its life cycle, you obtain specific emissions to the product that you bought, and there's no mixing between the other different products the supplier makes, and that can help you to purchase a lower intensity product, and if feasible, even collaborate with suppliers on product innovation. However, it does take quite a lot of time and it can be a bit cumbersome for those buying lots and lots of products, or those whose products that you potentially buy, swap and change regularly. So what I will say is that it's an excellent methodology for data, but fairly difficult to scale up to 100% of spend. Some companies like to set tough and strict requirements, stating that they will only work with organizations who meet a certain criteria, whereas others do prefer a slightly softer approach of trying to encourage, influence, and incentivize suppliers. Incentivization could range from supplier awards ceremonies and kind of recognizing those making progress, all the way through to preferential financing for suppliers who excel and meet high standards. So thank you for listening. Last slide, that's it from me. I really hope that that's been informative and clear. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them in the Q&A session today. Also on the final slide, I've provided my email address just there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. I already see a few questions in the chat. We're going to take them in the Q&A session at the end, and we're going to move on to Marcus. Thank you. Fabio, can you please move to Marcus' slide? Thank you.
Hello, and good afternoon or good morning or good day, wherever you are today calling in. Thank you very much for your interest. And again, I want to extend my appreciation to be invited to speak at this event today. As introduced, my name is Marcus McKay. I lead the Sustainable Supply Chains team at UNOPS, which is a United Nations agency which works in the area of project management, infrastructure, and procurement. I'm going to give a brief introduction as well into the organization, but then I'm going to jump straight in to the topic at hand today. Can I have the next slide, please? As expected, I'm obviously going to cover some focus areas on climate action. But what's important for me is for me to present essentially how we approach climate from under our sustainable procurement framework. The reason I'd like to do this is not only to acknowledge that climate action is part of a broader sustainability approach, but also it is part and parcel of how we approach sustainability in general. Although we do have targeted and committed activities. Can I have the next slide, please? UNOPS, as I mentioned, is a UN agency which focuses on infrastructure projects, project management and general procurement. We do also financial management and human resource management. We are slightly unique from an agency perspective, as we are a self-funding agency which focuses solely on project implementation. That means we are self-income generating rather than receiving core funding from the UN budget to implement a mandate. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all the details over the next couple of slides. I'm just going to touch on a couple of these key areas, but as Sonia mentioned, this presentation will be shared and we are also welcome to receive questions after this session. It's interesting actually because the previous speaker, Phoebe, was talking about the importance of sustainability and procurement teams working together. Well, I'm very proud that at UNOPS, we actually have a sustainable procurement team. It was recently renamed to the Sustainable Supply Chains team that I lead. And that's also to reflect the importance of things like supply chain impacts and namely emissions and carbon supply chain as well. So this is one of the steps that UNOPS took in order to try and drive sustainability activities through procurement by the establishment of a dedicated team. And we have additional resources to support this as well. UNOPS on average does a procurement volume of over $1.5 billion per year. But as I mentioned, we are demand driven and we do project implementation. So it's very difficult for us to predict what our procurement categories or catalog will be for dedicated projects, donors, or governments. But we do have some pretty prominent categories, those being medical equipment, consumables, pharmaceuticals, construction equipment, of course, for infrastructure, a lot of IT equipment, demining and disarmaments, as well as vehicles as well. So these are the categories which we're seeing moving up and down from a year to year. We also have a lot of long-term agreements, which also allows us to leverage our impact when it comes to sustainability efforts, as well as climate activity. And that's where we're going to see some of our early action or early movement around climate as well. What's important to know is UNOPS is a largely decentralized organization for procurement activities. That means if we are implementing a project in Papua New Guinea, which I was talking to my colleagues for yesterday, all of the procurement activities will be conducted from the office in Papua New Guinea. We don't do procurement out of our head office in UNOPS in Copenhagen, with the exception of some small central corporate procurement. We do have, as a result of that, a huge supplier base, which then starts adding to some of the challenges which I'll be highlighting later on in the session. But as promised to our moderator and host, I will also be talking about positive solutions, not only the challenges that we do face. Next slide, please. Just to drill down a little bit more into what these numbers mean, I'll leave them to you to read. I'll touch on a couple of them. Is that we're dealing on average of over 1,500 tenders on an annual basis going through our e-tendering platform. This doesn't include offline tenders or emergency procurement procedures as well. As I mentioned, we have a huge supplier base, but we also do try and focus on our supplier diversity by focusing on women in businesses also. And a significant portion of our volume is done through MSMEs. And as you can see with a number of 39%, to reinforce the decentralized component of our procurement, nearly 40% of our procurement is done from within the country that we're doing a project implementation. It's important to understand that UNOPS, as a UN agency, operates under the principles of public procurement. So we also work on best value for money, fairness, integrity, effective competition, and the best interest of UNOPS. Now, this is supposed to be reinforced, and the principles of sustainability are supposed to be embodied therein, and we do work on that. I'm going to talk about our Supplier Sustainability Programme, which gives us the ability to engage with our suppliers through different levels of screening, whether it's completely through collaborative efforts and dialogue, or from just receiving self-assessment data, all the way up to nearly 4,000 to 5,000 suppliers on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So bringing this conversation now to the topic of our climate activity. You know, through being completely transparent, UNOPS is a little bit behind the curve when it comes to our efforts on climate action. And we're recognizing the importance of accelerating this. Our acceleration is going to be done through dedicated resources within the team I work with, as well as additional resources within the procurement group. We have identified 3 core areas for us to be focusing on under mitigation, adaptation, and capacity development. And within this, we already have many components under our sustainable procurement framework, which allows us to work in these different streams of work. We will also be disaggregating our internal procurement as well as our external procurement for us to have a better understanding how better to work with our suppliers as well. But next slide, please. Under the existing work we're doing at the moment, as I mentioned, it falls under our sustainable procurement framework. And this then has 3 different layers of engagement. It focuses on general considerations. So this might be talking about things to consider in order to have some climate awareness or climate considerations during your tendering process. Then it gets into the mandatory requirements. It gets into what needs to be done at a contract or a different solicitation level, depending on what category you might be procuring. And I'll elaborate on this a little bit later. And then we also have categories which that are on the do not buy list, and they require a specific waiver for exception from the procurement director. and for the nature and the benefit of this presentation. For example, diesel generators are one of those categories, and they require an exemption and a waiver from the procurement director in order for you to procure. The third component of the framework identifies the categories, the dedicated programs that we use in order to help leverage and drive some of our key sustainability areas. And this is namely under supplier sustainability, diversity and inclusion, as well as other key areas of gender responsive procurement and disability inclusion. Next slide, please. So how do we then start communicating and bringing accessibility to this type of criteria at a tender level? We have developed an interactive dashboard, which not only communicates the policy requirements that our procurement officials have to use, but then in that section, as you can see on screen right, it shows you that the different categories and the different texts that you can use. So you can broadly build your tender on this interactive dashboard, and then it will say to you, okay, you're buying this category, you're buying this product, then here is the recommended text that we think you should use. This also takes into consideration the maturity of the market and the expectations that you can have. As mentioned by the previous speaker, and I touched on earlier, when you have an extremely diverse supplier portfolio, and you want to also embody the principles of equal opportunity and effective competition and fairness in tendering, you have to be very conscious of what your criteria you're using and the requirements that you're including at the tender level. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, and I keep coming back to it, sustainability is the overarching theme of our efforts, and that's why this slide touches on the different categories that you can see. But yes, I've pulled out the items that you can see under our climate change and activity. Within this selectable database, you can choose different type of disclosing emission data, depending on the market you're in, depending on the product category that you have. We also have different criteria depending on the maturity of the market, which can start focusing on the demonstration of their climate activities. This is also largely used on more mature categories. And then we also have the ability to build into our tenders a commitment to collaborate. And I'll talk about how we use this as an example in Argentina a little bit shortly. Depending on some of the products as well, for example, on vehicles, which is a mature market, there is an established ability to have standards, on things about IT equipment around labeling, and then we are able to embed these into the tender, and these fall under the different sustainability considerations. This might also be influenced by the spend threshold, as well as I mentioned earlier on the categories that you want. It's also worth noting, though, and the point around bulk packaging is really just the prompt for me, is to say that, a lot of our procurement officials, when they're building tenders, they do take other considerations in, which have a knock-on effect with climate activities. So when our procurement officials are talking about bulk packaging, centralized distribution, this is done not only with the lens of maybe environmental impact or only to be doing climate activities, it's also done in the broader spirit of sustainability. And one of the things that we do try to embody is that, sustainability activities touch on multiple things. Climate activities can have a knock-on effect on multiple items as well. And this is worth considering and noting. Next slide, please. When it comes to engaging directly with our suppliers, we do have a supplier sustainability assessment platform, and this is carried out and self-assessments are conducted by and large all of our suppliers that want to tender with UNOPS. Depending on the size of the project, the appetite of the office, the requirements or the expectations of our partner, there are different levels of engagement that are done, and I've put on the screen some samples of the work that we've done. For example, we did inspections in Denmark around mine clearing activities. We were in Mexico. We did a significant number of inspections around pharmaceutical procurement, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on what the appetite is and the needs are, we're able to customize our inspections, our different ways of doing verifications and follow-ups, and focus on different areas with the suppliers. This can, of course, also be climate activity. It can be different areas on environmental management. It could be around supply chain management as well. All I'm doing is just reminding everyone that we have a broader approach and we take different areas of looking at sustainability depending on what the needs are or the risk categories are. So, for example, we're doing a lot of work in small island developing states, and the climate threat to these nations is very severe, and these are areas that we work with suppliers where you might see more activity around climate action. Next slide, please. The example I'd like to focus on at the moment is about how we work with our suppliers on basically putting into a tender a commitment to collaborate and work with us if they were awarded a contract. And this was very positive for us because suppliers are very low capacity. In some cases, they're not able to even respond or provide input onto platforms like CDP. They're not even to be able to understand how to provide data to you on their own emissions. So one thing we're trying to do now is work with lower capacity suppliers on understanding how they can collaborate with us and understand the importance of doing their disclosure, how can they identify it, and what type of corrective actions they can take going forward. Next slide, please. We also have engagement platforms under our UNOPS Possibility Programme. And what we try to include in our rolling agenda with our suppliers is trying to bring awareness and understanding to them about the climate agenda. The UNOPS Possibilities Programme focuses predominantly on stimulating small to medium enterprises or other underrepresented business groups, women-owned businesses, disability inclusive businesses. And we try to bring at the earliest stage of understanding and the importance of climate activity and climate actions from MSMEs at a national level. Next slide, please. I'm moving through these quite quickly because I can see my time is running, so I apologize. I just want to touch on a couple of the challenges. We've got challenges due to our very broad mandate. The fact that we don't know and we can't forecast what type of categories or catalog we're working on. Our decentralized structure is also a huge challenge for us. And depending on the scale and the size of the project, it also influences our ability to have an influence. As I mentioned earlier on, we deal with a large number of suppliers which have extremely low capacity. And this presents one of the most biggest issues for us. The availability of accountable data is a huge challenge, as anyone who's working in this area will know. And we're having to start looking at the most useful way of having a hybrid solution for us to understand exactly what Phoebe said earlier on. Sorry, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And this is one of the biggest challenges we're having is trying to manage our climate action. We have to be able to measure it and understand it. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your time. If you have the ability to, I would encourage you to scan that QR code, and you can have a much deeper look at UNOPS procurement and how we try to generate impact through our procurement activities. But thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And Sarah, please go on with your presentation, and feel free to share your screen.
Great. Hi, everyone. Can I just confirm that you can see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. That's quite an exciting panel we have today. So I'm Sarah. I'm from the NHS in England. Just for those who are not familiar with the NHS, we are the sort of publicly funded healthcare system in England. In terms of size, it's about like 230 healthcare provider organizations, and we also cover primary care. So really like a big reach. And today we're here to speak about supply chain. So again, just to give a bit of a sense, we estimate that we have somewhere in the ballpark of 80,000 suppliers. As you can imagine, it's quite a difficult number to estimate, but it just gives us a sense of scale when we develop policies of, the sort of mass we have to think about. So just quickly, I tend to never start a presentation without just anchoring us into why we're talking about what we're talking. I probably preach to a lot of people who are already bought in and convinced, but why does it even matter for the health sector to think about carbon emissions? Well, because climate change has a direct impact on health. And so it is our mission to protect the health of the population. And we know that, you know, extreme weather events, air pollution, you know, new disease, all of this is having an impact on our population. And it's starting right now, right? Like something in England, last year we had a really, really warm summer in 2022. And we estimate like almost like 3,000 excess deaths just in that heat wave. So it is something that is affecting us right now. And it's also affecting us as a healthcare system on our ability to deliver care, because these are new conditions in which we have to perform a duty. And so again, if I take this example of the heat wave, you know, some of our theaters, it was difficult to like manage the temperature in the theater because, you know, our air conditioning system were struggling with such a big heat that was quite unusual for England. So and you know, you can imagine also performing like a surgeries or like running an A&E services in the middle of a flood or a storm. And so there's also all of these aspects. So that's why we care, and that's why we think that it's important for us to think about climate change. There's also an aspect of responsibility. The healthcare sector is about like this. If it was a country, it would be like the fifth like most emitting country in the world. So it is massive. Like in the UK, we're speaking about 5%, 4 to 5% of the emissions. So we can't ignore our own impact on climate change. And so that's why the NHS has been looking at this for a while now, and building on a lot of work that had been done on the front line by our staff, by our providers. We committed in 2020 to 2 targets. So what we've done is we've looked at the usual, like for those of you who are familiar, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions with our direct emissions or indirect emissions. And we've said, okay, what are these emissions where we think we can have a direct impact? And so we went a bit beyond scope 1 and 2, as you can see here on the left, because there are other things like our business travel or waste where we think actually these are emissions that we directly control. And so for this scope of what we call direct emissions, we've committed to reach net zero by 2040. But we didn't want to stop there. And today we're here to speak about supply chain, and there's a reason for that. As a healthcare system, we couldn't just function without everything that we buy. So basically without our supply chain. And so that's why we've also committed to reaching net zero on this extended scope that includes all of our supply chain by 2045. Sometimes these dates, they feel a bit like far away in the future. And I think, you know, what we know from the climate science today is that actually the carbon emission reduction have to happen now. Like it can't be something that happens in 20 years. And so that's why it's very important to have sort of near-term or interim targets. And so in our case, we've set 80% reduction target, you know, by 2028 and by 2036 on those 2 scopes, so that we also have this more immediate ambition. So I'm not going to speak about all of this, but it's just to give you a flavor of like all the aspects that the Green NHS program covers. So, you know, like is what you would expect in terms of like our estates, our medicines, our travel, but also, you know, how we need to transform the way our pathways are designed. You know, that's what we call clinical transformation, how we work with clinical specialties on those topics. But today we're here to speak about supply chain. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So this is what the NHS carbon footprint looks like. So basically, supply chain is everything here that you can see in blue. So as you can see, and that's pretty typical of the sort of like healthcare systems like the NHS. So like it wouldn't apply to all countries, but it's typical to like similar countries where we have almost 70% of our emissions in our supply chain. And out of those emissions, what is really significant is medicines. So medicines alone account for actually 25% of our footprint, because we've also embedded some in our direct emissions. And then just behind that, we have all of our medical equipment. And this is important for us to know because, you know, as the NHS, we look at everything we buy. So that includes our food, our IT, or, you know, border equipment. But we probably have less lever, whereas on those two categories, medicines and medical equipment, actually as healthcare systems, we are the main customer of the suppliers. And so we have a different to engage with them. So what have we done once we've seen that, you know, there were so many emissions in our supply chain, and, you know, we know that those emissions are, you know, probably embedded into the manufacturing lines, into the transport, and so those are not things that we have direct control over. So that's why we knew that we had to work with our suppliers. We had to find way, and Phoebe mentioned earlier, you know, carrot and stick approach. That's exactly the sort of like reflection we've had. And we started by setting ourselves an objective. And this objective was that by the end of the decade, we decided that we didn't want to continue working with suppliers who didn't at least align with our net zero trajectory. So it feels both far but soon at the same time, you know, when if we remember the 80,000 suppliers. But basically the idea is to get all of our suppliers on that net zero journey with us. Really, the idea was never to say, oh, you know, we'll cut our number of suppliers by half and only purchase from the good ones. No, the idea is really to bring them with us on the journey. And so what we did after setting that objective was to engage with our suppliers. So we've run a number of like engagement exercises. You see like here in the middle of the slide, a survey that we did to understand where they were at in terms of, you know, their emission measurement and like how ready they were to measure and disclose their emissions. And then we've done a lot of qualitative engagement with our trade bodies, with various groups, to understand a bit like what was feasible. And I think we set the bar at a place where actually it's not completely unrealistic. There was no point like setting targets which, you know, we knew our suppliers couldn't achieve, but was just high enough that actually we're accelerating things a bit. We're just pushing the ambition a bit further. And so what we heard from our suppliers is like, yes, we want to come with you on the journey, but please give us some visibility. Like, don't ask us to do something, you know, 1 month for the next, we will never be ready. Give us, you know, early warning, give us some heads up on what you're going to expect from us. And so that's why we published a roadmap, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, of what we're expecting from our suppliers when. And then as we go through each stage of that roadmap, obviously we bring more details. We refine exactly the policy, the requirement, and the support offer for our suppliers to help them to deliver on these requirements. So this is why this roadmap looks like. You might have seen different versions of it. Like I think it's at least the third design that we have now. So I'm quite happy because this one is quite recent. Hopefully it's clear. Basically, it started in 2022 where we've included some net zero and social value considerations in all of our tenders. I'll come back to that. Then from 2023, we're starting to look at company level targets. And so we're asking for our suppliers of contract above £5 million to have a carbon reduction plan on their scope 1 and 2 emissions and a subset of scope 3. Next year, we're going to extend that to cover much more procurements. And then from April 2027, we will extend that to also include scope 3 emissions. And then in 2028, we look at product level requirements. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do anything on product between now and 2028. It's just that given the scale and the diversity of the products that we buy, it was a bit difficult to start with requirements at product level, and it was much easier to start with requirements at company level, which is why we started with those carbon reduction plans. So I'm just going to give you a bit more details on what all of these mean. So starting with net zero and social value. Sorry. So what we do in all of our tenders is we say that a minimum of 10% of the score has to be about net zero and social value. So it can be one question, it can be more than one question, it can be 10%, it can be more than 10%. But what's important is that it has to be additional. So it can't be, oh, I'm delivering food and actually food is good for the environment. No, the question is, what else are you doing? You know, what is the additional thing you supplier are going to be doing in the delivery of this contract to reduce your emissions? So it can be an answer on the delivery, for example, or it can be an answer on what is done with, like, you know, the IT that the team use. So it has to be very specific. It has to be appropriate, so it can't, you know, be completely unrelated to the contract, the you know, the NHS priorities. And then finally, if possible, it has to be measurable. Like, for anything you would ask in a tender, you then want to be able to monitor it during the contract delivery. So you want to be able to embed it in your contract management. So the more like we get measurable commitments from our suppliers, the more we can then like monitor them during the delivery of the contract. So this is a tool that we're implementing at contract level. The advantage is that it can be very specific. It can also support, you know, local economies, social value. The difficulty that comes with it is it has to be specific. So for each contract, we sort of have to reinvent the question we're asking. We have to make sure our teams are trained on how to assess the response they're getting from suppliers. So it's a bit more complex in terms of implementation. The next milestone was on carbon reduction plan. So as I mentioned, so for now and up to April, we're only asking for carbon reduction plans for contract over £5 million. However, from April, we're going to start asking for them for any contract that come on a framework, which are like our big sort of procurement agreement. And then we have a sort of slightly easier version, which we call a net zero commitment for lower value contracts. So what does it look like? So first of all, it's very important to say that it's at the selection stage. So the 10% net zero and social value, it's a score, right? So it contributes to the sort of tender evaluation. Whereas the carbon reduction plan is a yes/no question. Either you have one, and then you can qualify and answer the tender questions, or you don't have one, and then you just can't qualify for the tender. So it's a very binary, but also very simple tool to implement because it's just like a yes/no check. What do we mean by a carbon reduction plan? So a carbon reduction plan is supposed to present the supplier's net zero target. The year of the target has to be at the latest by 2050. We encourage 2045 to align with our target. At the moment, the scopes of emissions covered need to be minimum 1 and 2, and we've also included a subset of scope 3, which are usually I describe them as the easy scope 3 emissions. And so in the carbon reduction plan, you're supposed to have your emissions on a base year and your emissions on a reporting year. And then you're supposed to give like a high level outline of what are the projects and the actions you're going to be taking to achieve your net zero target. What's really important about these plans is that we ask that they are board approved and publicly available. And that's important because we don't just want, you know, an empty promise from a supplier. We want to know that they've gone through an internal process to really make it like a company-wide commitment. We want to know that this is something they will be tracking along with their other objectives. And then publicly available because, you know, we want those plans to be open for scrutiny. So we've heard a lot, you know, from Marcus and from Phoebe that it's not easy for everyone. And so it's also really important for us to support our suppliers to comply with those requirements. So first of all, like we've done a lot of communications around increasing awareness. So that's the first step, right? We want our suppliers to be aware and to know that these requirements are coming. So you have here like a few examples of what we've done. But then we've also providing sort of like more targeted support. So we provide like webinars where suppliers can join and ask questions. We also provide a CRP checking service where they can just basically send their carbon reduction plan and get feedback in case, you know, they're not sure about what it should include. And then we are like thinking about sort of broader support offer and broader engagement. You know, we've been working with CDP for some suppliers. So that's the idea, right? Is to continue to support our supply chain, not necessarily by having the expertise ourselves, but also by bringing other expertise. And I'll just finish because I know today we have quite a diverse audience and you know, covering very different geographies. While I'm very proud that the NHS was the first healthcare system in the world to commit to net zero, actually, I'm even more happy to say that we're far from being the only one now. And so if you look at this map from the WHO, it tells you like all of the countries which have made a commitment to more sustainable healthcare systems. And when we speak about supply chain, this is especially important because our supply chains are global. You know, it is likely that a lot of the suppliers we have are the same among a number of countries. And so some work that we're doing, and you can see here on the right, the American colleagues who announced at COP, you know, how we were working together on these topics. Like, it's very important that we try to align. It's very important that, you know, we show suppliers that generally as a healthcare sector, we care. And it's also important that we avoid like unnecessary duplication and burden. So, you know, for example, as part of the questions we ask our suppliers, we try as much as possible to align them to the CDP questions so that if they've already done CDP, then it's easy for them to answer our questions. So we try to do that sort of things, and this is something we want to do more and more internationally. There's also a question of, you know, there are still some gaps in terms of methodology of how you assess a product level footprint. And so we're embarking on a program with the BSI, but again, more with a view of international collaboration on this to set what a standard for medicines footprinting could be. And then after that, maybe medical device and other medical equipment. So I would really encourage more and more international collaboration on these topics. And that's it for me. Hand over to Sonia.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Babia, if you could pull out our slides again, please. And we're going to start the Q&A session. We have quite a lot of questions in the chat. I will basically structure the session a little bit. So I would actually like to stay with Sarah for a second. There's one question from me and one question from the chat. I'll group them together. So the first question, which is mine, is, so why did the NHS choose to set out these, you know, quite strict requirements for suppliers? You know, really putting out this roadmap. If you could just, I know you touched upon it in your presentation, but if you could just make that very clear, like, you know, because there are other approaches where, you know, it's more about, you know, assessing them and then seeing, you know, how can they move on. But you chose a different approach, and I would just, you know, be curious to hear a bit more about that. And then the second one from the chat was, how did NHS arrive at the 80% reduction target specifically? And we pulled out the slide on that one as well.
Okay. Maybe I'll start with the second one. It's a shorter answer, but so the 80% reduction, basically, I didn't include it in my slide, but when we committed to net zero, we did like quite extensive analytical work and modeling to see what was feasible. So it's not like, you know, an empty commitment that we've made just you know, to look good. We've really done like a lot of analysis to try and see what could be a realistic, ambitious, but realistic trajectory. And that's how we've set the bar at the 80%. When we did all of those calculations, you know, like some of the standards that exist now for near-term target wasn't there. And so that's why we've chose that as a bar. this is maybe something that we'll look at in the coming years, but we have that trajectory year on year between now and 2045. And so that's how we set those dates for 80%. In terms of why we've made the decision, I wouldn't say that our approach is different. I would say, so we have both. I haven't had a chance to cover it in this presentation, but a bit like Phoebe said, we have the sort of stick and carrot. So for example, on the carrot approach, we have an assessment that's called the Evergreen Assessment, and that, enables suppliers to give us much more information than in a carbon reduction plan. And then in return, established maturity level. And so we show suppliers, first of all, we recognize the ones that are already doing great, but also we show a sort of like direction of travel for the ones who want to keep progressing. And then we have all of our support offers. So I think we're also having this sort of more supportive approach. But what we've heard, I mentioned at the beginning, we engage with our suppliers. One of the things we heard, interestingly, was please make this core business. And we've heard that from a lot of like sustainability teams within our suppliers companies, who sometimes were struggling to get real traction with the rest of the organization, because as long as these, criteria and requirements don't impact the ability for suppliers to make business, well, obviously it can't be as high a priority. And so that's actually feedback we heard directly from our suppliers, like please make sure that this is linked to business, so that it creates like a real incentive for the companies to look at it. And so that's why we've also had this approach of setting, slightly like binary criteria. They're not the more nuanced instruments, but actually they're very effective to make it, high on the priority list of the companies we work with.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Basically, staying a little bit with the carrot and stick approach, there was also a question in the chat about stating some examples of carrot and stick approaches, and I'm virtually looking at either Phoebe or Marcus. Maybe if you could just provide a few examples on, maybe Phoebe, what you see at what CDP members are doing, in terms of, incentivizing suppliers, but also, stricter approaches.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sonia. And sorry, I lost all the questions whilst I was presenting as my internet connection dropped just after I finished, which was good timing. So I don't know who asked that question, but thank you. I think it's a great question. In terms of other examples that I've seen that maybe we haven't mentioned today already, I think in terms of the carrot approach, we kind of on that topic of kind of building capacity and categorizing suppliers, any kind of touch point that the procurement team have, for example, a review or an appraisal, is kind of an opportunity to encourage them to do something regarding the environment, right? If they're looking at other aspects, for example, I don't know, modern slavery was one example. Why can't you also incorporate the environment and climate change within those conversations too? Also, I think in terms of categorizing, it can be really useful if you're providing feedback to suppliers to almost kind of make it a little bit competitive. Some of the companies that I work with, they will highlight where a supplier has performed versus their other suppliers, and that kind of incentivizes a little bit of peer pressure there, and I think it can work really well. Another aspect could be like award ceremonies, and all of this, by the way, hand in hand with support, which we do, which is necessary. In terms of the stick side of things, I think we've kind of touched quite a few of those already, sort of really integrating it into procurement decision making, into tendering processes, making it mandatory to disclose scope 1 and 2, for example. That is kind of on the other extreme end. Hopefully that's enough. I don't know if Marcus wanted to add anything to that.
It's a really interesting question for us, because as a international NGO stroke public entity stroke UN agency, we have to be very conscious of what the carrot and the stick actually means, because, as I mentioned earlier on, we're governed by our procurement principles, and one of them is about equal opportunity. So this is actually really difficult. There was another question as well, Sonia, if you don't mind me linking to this, which was directed at me around what were the challenges with criteria and stuff. It's actually this is one of the key challenges, because I really do sympathize with my procurement community, and I have a very good colleague on the call, so I know that some of them are also listening into this, is that, you know, they really want the performance of the procurement to go as well as possible. They don't want to put criteria in that then gets audited and then gets accused by the different authorities of favoring certain parties and not giving equal opportunity and equal access. This is why it's important that you don't necessarily have equal considerations in tender, but you actually have more equitable tenders. And what I mean by that is by making sure that you understand your market and you're able to ask for the certain things that you require. When I gave the example that we did in Argentina, when we're trying to explore what does it mean when you're dealing with a very diverse distribution of supplier capacity, what we identified is that if we can communicate a willingness to work with us, then we can actually open up different levels of collaboration. So the challenge is, to answer this second question actually, is that to ensure that the criteria is written in a way which can then respond to the market. The question said, so what was the lessons learned, or how will we get around this? Well, the best way is you have to understand your market. You have to know what the market's able to do. And then you can make informed decisions of whether how much you want to move the agenda or how much you want to use your tender to bring awareness and more further engagement to the topic at hand. Regarding carrot and stick, therefore, we would hope that the ability to participate in international tenders for public procurement or for UNOPS is enough of a carrot to get people to understand the responsibility that we have. And then as a result of improving those standards, you get more accessibility to larger pool of agencies, for example, within the UN. But this also doesn't mean that we're perfect in what we're doing. And we need to find better ways of rewarding suppliers and the private sector for the efforts and the actions that they take. And we need to identify how to improve and make this better as well, because we are also being called to action and called to task by the private sector, because they are responding to the call to action. And we need to find the best way within our space and principles of equal opportunity and fair competition of how to reward that. And we continue working on this.
Thank you very much, Marcus. There were a few more questions directed to you, and I think you partly touched upon them in your response, but did you wanted to add anything further regarding, you know, there was one question on smaller suppliers from the global south that might not have the data nor the capacity to create a carbon reduction plan, and how you deal with that. I think you touched upon the challenges when implementing the criteria, and then there was one more on competitive priority, so sustainable procurement versus savings versus a balanced supplier base. So you touched upon it partly. I was just wanted to check in if there was anything you wanted to add more specifically.
Yeah, of course. I can cover most of that. Actually, I think the thing is we've got to be conscious of what we're trying to achieve when you're working with suppliers of a lower capacity. You have to be realistic what the expectations are, and you have to kind of take a step down from sometimes the position that you're in. If you have a genuine focus about trying to have impact, you have to understand that things take time, and then you might have to lower your own expectations in order to increase the potential impact over time. What I mean by that is that if you're dealing with a supplier that hasn't got the first idea about what climate activities are, you're not actually achieving anything by asking them to share with you a climate action plan. Depending on the environment that you're in, you might actually be forcing a supplier into a position to just create something which is meaningless. It's better to understand that the environment the supplier is in and say, okay, can you demonstrate if there's any company commitments, and what are these commitments? And these commitments might be very small. They might just start with awareness raising. They might just start introducing training exercises just to the senior management that don't even get down to the shop floor, for the want of a better description. So you have to understand what your expectations are, and then develop those expectations in line with what the suppliers are. The private sector are hungry to be able to respond to how to improve their competition. And yeah, we generally find that suppliers are very responsive when we're giving them an opportunity to be on a level playing field and then learn. I always challenge the fact that, you know, suppliers will make up information. I think it depends on the environment that you create and the circumstances you put suppliers in. The second part of the question, Sonia, what was that again? Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, it was regarding competitive priorities.
Oh yeah, competitive priorities. Yeah. Yep. I mean, I don't want to take the floor for this, so I'll be quite quick. One of the areas we focus on is not separating sustainability and procurement. One of the efforts our team work on is to say that our procurement is sustainable procurement. There is no such thing as procurement, and there is no such thing as sustainable procurement. Procurement is either sustainable in the nature of its activities or not. If I was going to be provocative, I would say we should have non-sustainable procurement and sustainable procurement. So the point is that we try to balance priorities by saying, well, this is the nature of our activities. We are all corporate citizens. We all have a responsibility and an obligation to have a positive impact in all of our activities that we do, and that includes our procurement. So we are trying to demystify this notion of, let's say, procurement and sustainable procurement. But you do have competitive priorities because the budget limitations, you might have environmental conditions, you might have market capacity limitations. So you're supposed to then identify what is you're going to get the best bang for your buck. Very quickly, an example which we had certain criteria that was expected in a certain market. It was actually around gender. The project manager came and discussed and said that, listen, this is an area of very sensitive, high risk for health and safety for women, lots of gender-based violence. It would be better if we were focusing on environmental criteria because of the desertification of the nature of the environment. This is two competing agendas. We need to push the gender agenda, but we also need to address on a risk-based approach. In order to respond to competitive priorities, I would focus on a risk-based approach to identify where the best needs are for certain things. But I would also encourage people to stop talking in principle about sustainable procurement and procurement as two separate entities.
Thank you, Marcus. And I think it would be interesting also to get Sarah's view. So, you know, we touched quite a bit on what are some of the challenges working with smaller suppliers or suppliers that might not have the capacity either to respond to an assessment or to put in place a carbon reduction plan. And then also, I think it would be interesting for Sarah to speak to the question on how to bring procurement staff on board.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think those are the right questions to ask. I mean, the approach we've taken is we set a bar that can fit, you know, a big number, but then within that bar we build in the nuance and, you know, the possibility for suppliers either to get specific support or to have a bit of a margin. Or I think, you know, those blunt instruments that we use are really to get people started. We know that we're not going to achieve net zero just by our suppliers having carbon reduction plans, let's be honest. But it is a way to put it on the radar, to have people to start caring. Because, you know, if you can't measure your emission today, if you don't start trying, you're not going to be able to do it tomorrow. And so that's really the spirit. But then we have this most nuanced, like, sort of supporting approach, both in terms of, you know, signposting to resources, giving some, you know, options. If, like, for example, you know, in our policy, if a supplier is really struggling to get their emissions, you know, they have options to still submit a carbon reduction plan. And so we are bringing in that nuance. And then with a tool like our Evergreen Assessment, which I also mentioned, we give even more detail. We also give the opportunity for suppliers to share case studies, which give us sort of more qualitative understanding of what they're focusing on, and something that we're going to do more and more. And I think it completely that comes back to what Marcus was saying about, you know, knowing your suppliers, knowing the product is, you know, in the coming years, I would expect us to have a more like industry specific approach. At the moment, we already have like, you know, the more targeted approach on medicines, just by the sheer fact that in the NHS, the way we procure medicines is different from the way we procure anything else. But I would expect in the coming years to have that more like industry specific approach. You know, what are the challenges in the food industry? What are the challenges in like the big medical equipment? What are so that we can have more of this conversation, we can join efforts, we can also like help suppliers like share best practice and share learnings. And that's also why we work a lot with trade bodies, because this is where we can, you know, bring the suppliers together and like have a space to share, you know, the difficulties and how to overcome them. So I'd say that's what we're doing. And again, I think there is value in having requirements that are a bit blunt, like the CRP, but that, you know, can already get people started. And then something a bit more nuanced, like for example, the 10% weighting, which can be a bit more specific to the contract, which can be more specific to you know, the market that we are engaging with. I think your second question was about staff engagement, and I mean, Marcus, I would completely agree, right? Like sustainable procurement shouldn't be a thing. And, you know, when we speak about healthcare, I think the word sustainability has been used for a long time, just in terms of, you know, how do we make our healthcare system sustainable, right? Like sustainable in the broader sense of just durable. We know, you know, a system like the NHS is constantly under budget constraints. And, you know, we constantly have to deliver, you know, better quality, better care, and, you know, with the budget, that's always a challenge. So one thing that I'd say on that is we also try to bring it to life to show that actually environmental sustainability, you know, social sustainability, sometimes and more often than we think, also aligns with financial sustainability. And sometimes actually a greener product might be more expensive at the start, but over the course of the product life cycle actually becomes much more cost efficient. So I think that's also important to, you know, come back to, you know, procurement is about delivering value for money, and so all the aspects of that value, it's important to bring in. I'd say that again, we've tried to implement different tools to make it easy for our procurement staff, because we also have teams that are under a lot of constraints, and you know, it is difficult. We are struggling. You know, we spoke about conflicting priorities. We are, you know, the NHS is struggling for staff, and we're struggling for budget, and so, you know, sometimes it's one of those things, and there's so many things. So this is where showing the co-benefits and the synergy with everything else can be useful. The same way we have a support program for suppliers, we also have an internal support program. We try to make it as easy as possible for procurement people to embed our policy into their practice. So for the ones who, you know, don't have like a specific interest or don't want to actually make it easy in our systems to just, you know, well, if you need to check a CRP, these are the 5 things you need to check. It's actually pretty quick. We have like a checklist, you know, for them to use. We have some resources for the ones who want to go a bit further. Then we give them a bit more material and a bit more background. So we have some training modules also. And again, I think it's important that procurement people speak to procurement people. So really like fostering this like sharing of best practice, sharing of learnings. You know, we have some of our healthcare like acute trust, which are actually more ambitious, who are going faster, who are like saying that they'll reach net zero by 2040, and so who already have like fully developed supplier engagement program. So this is great. We also build on that so that they can also share their learning at local level. But yeah, it's very important to have these very simple resources that to make people feel like it's not yet an additional burden. But first of all, it's something that is core because it's delivering value for money. It is something to be proud of because it is, you know, something that can deliver actual impact. And then it's something that doesn't require that much more work, or maybe not even any more work, just to make it easy to embed.
Thank you, Sarah. We start to run out of time. I've got a few questions that I would really like to ask you. So maybe we can just keep the next responses super short. I had one for Marcus, which is, you know, going a bit away from the specific focus on procurement, but also thinking about more structural changes, you know, the operational model, where do you place your distribution centers? Is this also something you're considering, and how? And please keep it short.
Yeah, I'll be as brief as possible, but this is actually a really important question, because I think it's not, I don't want to say it's overlooked, but I don't think it's given the appreciation that it has, that if we want to really drive change and have large scale impact, it also requires considerations also from an operating model. If you're going to try and, for example, optimize the efficiencies for freight, well, then you might have to also consider what's going to have the implications on, let's say, your stock holding potential. You know, organizations don't want to hold stock. There's liability there. But there's then going to be, if I can take the question from the audience, there's going to be conflicting priorities. And what's the cost of these conflicting priorities? Because also, if you want to then reduce your footprint from freight, then you might have to consider different modalities for your distribution. So then our organizations, are they prepared to build a centralized distribution center in a different region of the world simply to reduce their footprint, rather than shipping it to a centralized distribution center, repackaging it, reorganizing it, and then distributing it globally, like many large organizations do? Well, naturally, you could then argue, well, if you were then receiving goods largely from Asia, would it not be better to have a centralized distribution center, or a regional distribution center, sorry, put in Asia? Now, this would have a huge impact on reducing your emissions. And I think that this level of conversation isn't being brought up enough. It would be a little bit different for UNOPS, if I link it to our organization, because we would benefit from the fact that we don't have centralized procurement. So the fact that we do nearly 40% of our procurement in country, that would then be a natural benefit for us on our emissions. But if you're a centralized, an organization which has centralized procurement, then there's going to be much larger implications on how you're going to be moving your goods around the world, when we know at this stage, with the level of maturity or the lack of maturity in this space, that freight is the lowest hanging fruit that we have. And I think that we also need to start having conversations, webinars like this, where we start talking about organizational implications, the modalities that we need to take when we're talking about structures, and the ability to change the way we're looking. Like I said, we don't want to hold stock. Stock is financial liability, but holding stock might be a very easy way for you to reduce your emissions when you come to redistribution of your goods from a procurement perspective. I mean, I won't elaborate. I can keep going, but for the benefit of time, I'll just leave it there. But I'm happy to pick up the conversation another time.
Thank you. And basically, just to mention that it's also, you know, the best procurement emissions are those that are not haven't even gotten created in the first place.
Exactly.
And also, you know, it's supplier engaging with suppliers is one thing, but also thinking about your operational setup. Basically.
And why do people have centralized procurement for redistribution, for argument's sake? Well, you also take things into consideration like quality control. So how is quality control now going to be influenced by your decision to affect your distribution and your movement of goods?
I want to take 3 more questions for Phoebe, and if you could just answer them each with only 1 sentence, please, because I'd like to get them in. So Phoebe, there were a few questions on assessments. So one, to clarify, how is CDP's work different from the Global Compact? Does the CDP make on-site assessments? And then there's a question of what is three of you, and we're just going to answer them super quickly about the sharing of supplier assessments. You know, where are we there between the different organizations? So Phoebe, I give the floor to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to remember all of those off the top of my head. In terms of the verification question, so we do ask suppliers to provide any third-party assurance or process they have in place for verifying their own emissions separately. We have a list of accredited partners, but ultimately the data reported through the questionnaire is self-reported. So companies can rely on the kind of CDP score perhaps as an element of to what degree a supplier has kind of very well demonstrated their sustainability strategy. Oh gosh, sorry, when I get three questions at once.
The difference to the UN Global Compact.
Oh, yes, of course. So UN Global Compact is a commitment, a public commitment, whereby you have to get your C-level involved and signing off on that. CDP is a disclosure platform. So, you could use the CDP platform almost to demonstrate you're in keeping with that kind of commitment and use the CDP framework in that sense. But you are responding to CDP on behalf or on request of whichever stakeholder has requested you, be that through investors or be that through a supply chain member.
Thank you. And I think we have to stop here. Okay. And in terms of the questions, just to finish it off, I would like Sarah and Marcus just to give one sentence of advice also to smaller organizations that get started on the journey, and then I'll wrap it up. So let Sarah go first. In terms of, what would be advice and specifically for smaller organizations?
Get started. So I think as you've heard today, there's no right approach or wrong approach. But having those conversations, showing that it is important, looking at the levers you have, and just start somewhere to show that we care is probably the most important.
Thank you. Marcus?
I'd just say that, we're all in this together. So either if you're a supplier or a client, then appreciate each other. The fact that we're all struggling with this, and it's not easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't have these problems at hand. So my sentence is simply about just being appreciative of the challenges that we all have, whether you're someone like me who has expectations imposed on me for whatever it is, or the expectations I impose on my supply base. I think we can only do this together, and we need to kind of respect each other while we're trying to work on this.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. As the topic of supplier engagement is so important, is such a hot topic at the moment. Our friends and partners from the Joint Initiative for Sustainable Humanitarian Assistance, Packaging Waste Management, also have a webinar which is taking place on Thursday, 1st of February. You have the link in the slide deck that we'll share soon. So I'll encourage you also, if you want to learn about more information, different approaches, then please do join their webinar. And then next slide, just some marketing for ourselves. We also, we have monthly webinars, and we also have a Solutions Hub platform where you can find different approaches or solutions, guidance, resources on all types of climate and environmental topics. And then you can also follow us, next slide please, on LinkedIn and contact us via email if you want to know more about what we're doing at the Climate Action Accelerator. Thank you very much to the three speakers. I think you were great. Thanks to you for sharing your insights and for answering all the questions. And looking forward to being in touch with all of you again. Have a nice afternoon or morning wherever you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.